I never believed in Bigfoot, not even a little bit. Growing up on a cattle ranch in eastern Oregon, I'd heard all the stories. Campfire tales about giant hairy creatures lurking in the mountains, tourists claiming they saw something by the road at dusk, local hunters swearing they'd found footprints the size of dinner plates, that sort of thing. Bar talk mostly. Stories that got bigger with each telling and each round of drinks. I always figured it was bears standing on their hind legs, or shadows playing tricks on people's eyes when the light hit the trees just wrong, or maybe just too much whiskey and an overactive imagination. My grandfather homesteaded this land back in the 30s during the Depression, cleared the trees himself, and built the first cabin with his own hands. My father expanded it over 40 years of hard work, adding more acreage, better fencing, a proper barn and house. Now I run 400 acres near the Wallowa Mountains, raising Black Angus cattle the same way my family always has. Honest work, simple life, nothing fancy. In all that time, across 3 generations of working the same stretch of land, nobody in my family ever saw anything stranger than a cougar creeping through at night or a black bear raiding the apple trees in fall. So when weird things started happening last September, Bigfoot was the absolute last thing on my mind. I was thinking predators, maybe disease in the herd, possibly vandals from town. Anything that made sense in the normal world I'd always known. Anything that fit into the categories I understood. I wasn't prepared for what was actually happening. Nobody could have been. The reason I'm sharing this story is simple. What I captured on my trail cameras changed everything I thought I knew about what lives in those mountains. I've got footage that'll make your skin crawl, and a story that still keeps me up at night, even months later. Whether you believe it or not is entirely up to you. I'm not here to convince anyone of anything, but I'm telling you exactly what happened, exactly how it happened, step by step, detail by detail. I'm telling you why I'll never look at my property the same way again, why I check the tree line every evening before dark, and why I leave offerings at the edge of the forest once a week without fail. This isn't a ghost story or a legend passed down through generations. This happened to me on my land over the course of 6 weeks last fall. I've got the footage to prove it, hundreds of clips stored on a hard drive in my desk. I've got the physical evidence too, torn fence posts, tufts of fur, plaster casts of footprints that shouldn't exist. Most importantly, I've got a completely different understanding of the wilderness that surrounds my property and what might be living just beyond the reach of our porch lights. Mid-September hit like it always does in eastern Oregon. Cool mornings where you can see your breath, warm afternoons that make you shed your jacket, and the cattle settling into their autumn routines as the grass starts to brown. Except this year, they weren't settling at all, not even close. I noticed it first on a Tuesday evening around 6:30 when I went out to do my evening check before dinner. This is part of my daily routine, has been for 20 years. Walk the fence line, count the herd, make sure everybody's healthy and accounted for. Simple rancher stuff. Usually by this time of year, the cattle spread out across the pasture to graze on whatever's left of the summer grass before the first frost hits. They're relaxed, moving slowly, some lying down to chew their cud. It's peaceful. But that particular evening, they were all bunched together in the southeast corner of the main pasture, pressed up against each other like they were trying to form a single massive unit. All 80 head of them standing in this tight cluster, barely moving. The calves were in the center, the cows surrounding them in protective formation, the bulls on the outer edge facing outward. I walked out there through the tall grass, my boots crunching on the dry ground, thinking maybe a coyote had spooked them earlier in the day and they were still jumpy. Coyotes are a constant problem out here. They'll take down calves if they get the chance, and the cattle know it. But when I got close enough to really look around the area, I didn't see anything unusual. No tracks in the soft earth near the water trough, no scat, no signs of a scuffle. The fence was intact all the way around the perimeter, nothing obviously wrong. The cattle watched me approach with this nervous energy I'd rarely seen before. Ears twitching at every sound, the wind in the trees, a bird taking off, the distant sound of my truck engine ticking as it cooled down. Their eyes were wide, showing white at the edges. A few of them snorted and stamped their feet when I got within 20 yards. This wasn't normal cattle behavior, not for my herd. These animals know me, trust me. I've raised most of them from calves. They don't spook when I walk up. When I tried to move them back toward the main pasture where the best grazing was, they wouldn't budge. Normally, I can get them moving with a few shouts and some arm waving, basic herding behavior. But that evening, they just stared at me, feet planted, refusing to leave their defensive cluster. It took me a solid 20 minutes of yelling and walking back and forth, basically annoying them into compliance before they finally broke formation and scattered. Even then, they didn't go far, just moved to a different corner of the pasture and immediately grouped right back up again, facing the same direction, toward the western tree line. The next morning brought more of the same strange behavior. Cattle all grouped together again, this time in the northeast corner, refusing to spread out and graze in the western pasture like they normally would. That pasture has the best grass on the property, stayed green longer than the rest through the summer, and the cattle usually mob it this time of year. But there they stood, huddled and nervous, acting like something invisible was keeping them away from that side of the ranch. That's when I noticed the horses acting strange too. I keep 3 horses on the property, 2 quarter horses I use for herding cattle in the rough terrain, and an old mare that's been with us for going on 15 years now. That mare, she's seen everything. Lightning storms that would make a grown man nervous, she barely flinches. Rattlesnakes crossing the path, she just sidesteps them calm as you please. Mountain lions screaming in the night, she sleeps through it. I've ridden her through situations that would spook a younger horse into bucking, and she's never given me a moment's trouble. But that Wednesday morning, when I tried to lead her toward the western pasture to check the fence line like I do every week, she planted her feet in the dirt and would not move forward. Would not. I pulled on the lead rope, clicked my tongue, used every trick I knew to get a stubborn horse moving. Nothing. Her ears went flat back against her head, pressed so tight they almost disappeared into her mane. Nostrils flaring wide, pulling in air like she was trying to identify a scent. Her whole body trembling, muscles tense and quivering under her coat. In 15 years, I had never seen her like this. Never. The other 2 horses were exhibiting the exact same behavior. I could lead them anywhere else on the property without issue. To the barn, to the east pasture, up to the north fence, no problem. But the moment I tried to head west toward that tree line, they'd stop dead in their tracks. Ears back, eyes rolling, whole body language, screaming fear and refusal. Something out there beyond those trees had them absolutely terrified, and I still couldn't figure out what it was. I spent most of that day checking the entire western section of the property for signs of predators. Walked every inch of fence line with my eyes on the ground, looking for tracks in the soft dirt near the water sources. Checked for bear scat. They leave unmistakable evidence when they're around, big piles full of berries and partially digested plant matter. Looked for cougar scratch marks on trees where they sharpen their claws, usually on pine trees with soft bark. Searched for kill sites where a predator might have taken down a deer or elk, which would explain why they were hanging around my ranch waiting for another opportunity. Found absolutely nothing that would account for this level of fear in my animals. Then the dogs started in with their strange behavior. I've got 2 blue heelers that live outside year-round, sleep in the barn on old horse blankets, help me move cattle when I need an extra hand. Best working dogs I've ever owned in 40 years of ranching, fearless and smart and absolutely tireless. These dogs have faced down angry bulls without backing up an inch, chased coyotes off the property without hesitation, barked bears out of the apple trees. Nothing phases them under normal circumstances. I'd go out there multiple times each evening with my big 6-cell Maglite flashlight, the kind that weighs about 3 pounds and could double as a club if you needed it to. I'd shine that beam toward the trees, sweeping it back and forth across the tree line, trying to catch whatever the dogs were seeing. Sometimes I'd see the reflection of deer eyes way back in the woods, that greenish glow that means whitetail or mule deer bedded down for the night. Sometimes I'd catch a raccoon or a possum scurrying around the base of a tree, normal forest animals doing normal forest things. But the dogs wouldn't stop their barking no matter what I showed them with the flashlight. I'd point the beam right at a deer, say, "Look, it's just a deer, nothing to worry about." They'd glance at it and immediately go back to barking at something else, something deeper in the forest that I couldn't illuminate with my light. This went on for a week straight, every single evening like clockwork. My wife kept asking what had them so worked up, and I had no answer that made any sense. I figured maybe it was elk moving through the area, or possibly a pack of coyotes setting up denning territory nearby. Irritating for sure, but nothing to lose sleep over. Looking back on it now with everything I know, I should have recognized that something was seriously wrong much earlier than I did. The animals knew, they sensed it weeks before I caught on, using instincts that evolution gave them for exactly this kind of situation. Instincts that we humans have mostly lost in our comfortable modern lives. The cattle knew there was a threat nearby. The horses knew, the dogs knew. They were all trying to tell me in the only ways they could, and I just kept dismissing it as normal wildlife behavior. But humans are stubborn creatures. We like our world to make sense, to fit into the categories we've built up over a lifetime of experience. And my lifetime of experience on this ranch said that there are no monsters in these mountains, no cryptids, no unknowns, nothing that can't be explained by conventional wildlife biology. So I ignored the warning signs and kept to my routine, figuring whatever was bothering the animals would eventually move on like everything else does. Elk pass through, bears wander down from the high country, coyotes set up shop for a season and then leave. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. Except this time, I was wrong. Dead wrong. And I was about to find out just how wrong in the worst possible way. Early October arrived, first week, crisp and clear. I went out at dawn like I always do to move the cattle to fresh pasture, walking through the morning mist that sits low over the grass before the sun burns it off. The air smelled like autumn, that mix of dry grass, fallen leaves, and the first hint of wood smoke from someone's chimney down the valley. Beautiful morning, the kind that makes you grateful to be a rancher despite all the hard work and uncertainty. Then I found him, one of my best breeding bulls, lying dead in the middle of the east field, maybe 200 yards from the barn. Just lying there on his side, legs extended, stiff and cold. My stomach dropped straight through my boots when I saw him from a distance. That particular bull was worth close to $3,000, solid Black Angus genetics, proven breeder, never had a sick day in his 5 years of life. Strong, healthy animal in his prime. And now he was dead for no apparent reason that I could see from where I stood. I walked over to him slowly, part of me hoping I was seeing things wrong, that he was just sleeping in an odd position. But no. Dead. Definitely dead. His eye was open and glazed over, flies already starting to gather on his nose and mouth despite the cool morning temperature. Rigor mortis had set in fully, which meant he'd been dead for at least several hours, probably most of the night. I walked around the body slowly, carefully, looking for any signs of what killed him. Checked his entire body from nose to tail. No visible wounds that I could see. No blood anywhere on his hide or on the ground around him. No defensive injuries on his legs or face that would suggest he'd fought with another bull or defended himself from a predator. His legs weren't broken or twisted at odd angles. No sign of bloat in his stomach, which rules out overeating or gas buildup. Nothing in his mouth or around his nose to suggest he'd eaten something toxic. No foam or excessive drool. He just looked like he'd laid down and died peacefully, which absolutely does not happen with healthy 5-year-old bulls in their prime. These animals don't just keel over dead for no reason. Something killed him, I was certain of that. But what? I called the vet right away on my cell phone, told him I needed him to come out as soon as possible. While I waited for him to arrive, I checked the entire area around the body, walking in expanding circles, looking for any clue that might explain this death. I thought maybe he'd gotten tangled in loose wire and injured himself internally struggling to get free. Or maybe he'd eaten some toxic plant that grows in patches around the property. Larkspur, lupine, loco weed, any of the usual suspects. Or possibly he'd drunk bad water from a contaminated source. I was grasping at explanations, trying to make sense of something that made no sense. That's when I found the footprints, and everything changed. About 20 feet from the bull's body, right at the edge of a muddy patch near the water trough, where the ground stays soft from constant overflow. There they were, clear as day in the morning light. At first glance from a distance, I thought they were bear prints. They were absolutely huge, way bigger than any human footprint I'd ever seen. Bigger than my own boot prints, bigger than my hand spread wide. Enormous. But the more I looked at them, really studied them up close, the less sense they made as bear prints. Yes, they had 5 toes like a bear. But the arrangement was all wrong. Bears have their toes in a curved line across the front of their paw, with the big toe on the inside. These prints had the toes arranged more like a human foot, big toe on one side, 4 smaller toes graduated in size going across. The shape of the foot itself was wrong for a bear too. Too narrow through the middle, too elongated from heel to toe. The heel print was deep and rounded, more like a human heel than the elongated pad of a bear's hind paw. The prints were at least 18 inches long from heel to the tip of the longest toe, maybe even 20 inches. I'm not exaggerating that measurement. I actually got down on my hands and knees and measured them against my own boot, which is size 11. These prints dwarf my boot, made it look like a child's shoe by comparison. And they were pressed deep into the mud, at least 2 inches down, which meant whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Way heavier than any person, probably pushing 500 pounds or more based on how deep the impressions went. I pulled out my phone and took photos from every angle, making sure to get my boot in the frame for scale. Took close-ups of the toe prints, the heel, the overall shape. The more photos I took, the more disturbed I became. These weren't bear prints. I've seen plenty of bear prints in my 40 years on this property, both black bear and the occasional grizzly passing through from farther north. I know what bear tracks look like. These were something else entirely. I tried hard to tell myself a story that made sense. Maybe it was a bear that came to investigate after the bull died from natural causes. Bears are curious. They investigate dead animals all the time, looking for an easy meal. Maybe this bear walked around the body on its hind legs for some reason, checking it out, then decided the bull was too big to scavenge and moved on. That explanation almost worked. Almost. It fit most of the facts. But something about those prints bothered me deep in my gut. The stride length between them was too long for a bear walking on its hind legs. I paced it out, about 4 feet from one print to the next. Bears don't maintain that kind of stride when they're upright. They waddle, their gait is awkward and short-stepped. These prints showed a confident, long-strided bipedal walk. The weight distribution was too even, too balanced, and when I looked at how the toes had pressed into the mud, I could see they'd flexed on impact, gripping the ground the way human toes do when you walk barefoot. Bear claws don't flex like that. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I was letting my imagination run away from me. These had to be bear prints. What else could they be? The alternative, that something humanoid but impossibly large had walked through my property last night, was too ridiculous to consider. I don't believe in Bigfoot, never have. It's campfire nonsense, blurry photos, and hoaxes. So these were bear prints, end of story, and I needed to stop making them into something they weren't. The vet arrived around 10 that morning in his white pickup truck, parking near the barn and walking out to meet me in the field. Good man, been taking care of my animals for 15 years, knows his business. He did a thorough field examination of the bull, checking everything I'd already checked and then some. Pulled back the lips to check the gums for signs of poisoning or disease. Pressed on the stomach to check for bloat or obstruction. Examined the eyes, the nose, the hooves. Spent a good 20 minutes going over that bull from every angle. Finally, he stood up, wiped his hand on his jeans, and admitted he couldn't find any obvious cause of death. Said it might have been a lightning strike from that storm we'd had a few nights before. Sometimes lightning can kill an animal without leaving visible burns or marks. Or possibly a massive sudden heart attack, which does happen occasionally with bulls, though usually there are warning signs first. Or maybe an aneurysm that burst internally. He said the only way to know for certain would be a full necropsy, cutting the animal open and examining all the internal organs. I told him not to bother with that. The cost of a necropsy wasn't worth it at this point, probably run me $500 or more, and the bull was already dead. Nothing we learned from cutting him open would bring him back or prevent the same thing from happening again unless we knew what to look for. Sometimes on a ranch, you just have to accept a loss and move on. It's part of the business, the risk you take raising livestock. Then I walked the vet over to the muddy patch and showed him the footprints. Pointed them out, showed him the photos on my phone with my boot for scale, asked him what he thought. He barely glanced at them before saying they were bear prints, probably a big black bear passing through, nothing to worry about. Just shrugged it off like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I wanted to believe him desperately. I really did. If an educated man with a veterinary degree said they were bear prints, then they were bear prints. End of discussion. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was wrong. The more I stared at those prints after he left, the more convinced I became that they weren't made by any bear. Bears don't walk on two legs for extended distances like this. They can stand upright briefly, sure, but they don't stride across a field leaving perfectly spaced bipedal tracks. And the spacing between the prints suggested bipedal movement, one foot in front of the other in a straight line, exactly the way a human walks or runs, not the side-by-side waddle of a bear on its hind legs. After the vet left, I spent the rest of that day dealing with the dead bull, the unpleasant but necessary work of getting him loaded onto my tractor using chains and the front loader bucket. Heavy, messy, depressing work. Had to drag him off the property to a spot where I could let nature take its course, where the scavengers could have him without being too close to the house or the other cattle. Turkey vultures would find him within a day, then the coyotes and ravens. Within a week, there'd be nothing left but bones bleaching in the sun. My wife asked at dinner that evening if I'd figured out what killed the bull, and I told her no. Probably just bad luck or a freak heart attack. These things happen sometimes on a ranch. She accepted that explanation and went back to her meal. But that night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. Something had been on my property last night, something big and heavy that walked on two legs. And whatever it was, my animals had been sensing its presence for weeks. The logical part of my brain kept insisting it had to be a bear. That was the only explanation that made any sense in the world I knew. But another part of my brain, a deeper, more primitive part, was screaming that this was something else. Something that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught about wildlife in the Pacific Northwest. Something that existed in old stories and grainy photographs, but not in real life. I pushed that thought away hard, refusing to even consider it. I'm a practical man, a rancher. I deal in facts and evidence, not in legends and campfire tales. The next morning, first thing after finishing the basic chores of feeding and watering, I drove into town to the sporting goods store and bought 6 trail cameras. The good kind with infrared night vision and motion sensors, not the cheap ones that miss half their shots or drain batteries in a week. Told the clerk behind the counter that I was trying to get pictures of the elk that moved through my property in the fall, which was partially true. Elk do pass through sometimes, though that wasn't really why I was buying cameras. I needed to know what was coming onto my land at night. I needed evidence, something concrete I could look at and analyze. I figured if something was prowling around my ranch after dark, the cameras would catch it. Bears, coyotes, mountain lions, whatever was out there. At least then I'd know what I was dealing with and could plan accordingly. Maybe I'd need to reinforce the fence in certain areas or set up better lighting near the barn or start bringing the cattle in closer at night. Can't solve a problem until you know what the problem actually is. That's always been my philosophy on the ranch. I spent that entire afternoon and the following morning setting them up strategically around the property. Put 2 cameras along the western fence line where the horses had been refusing to go. 1 camera positioned near the water trough where I'd found those disturbing footprints. 2 more along the northern property boundary where the forest comes closest to the pastures. And 1 pointed directly at the main cattle pasture from an elevated position on the barn. Mounted them securely on fence posts and sturdy tree trunks about 6 feet off the ground, angled down slightly to catch anything moving through at ground level. Set each one to shoot both still photos and short video clips when triggered by motion, activated by the heat signature of living creatures. The batteries were fresh from the package, memory cards completely empty and ready to record. Everything tested and ready to go. When I told my wife what I was doing, she asked if I really thought we had a predator problem. I said I wasn't sure, probably just bears, but I wanted to know for certain. She seemed satisfied with that answer, though I could tell she thought I was overreacting. Maybe I was. But between the dead bull, the spooked animals, and those massive footprints, I needed to know what was happening on my own land. The first 3 nights, the cameras caught exactly what I expected. Deer wandering through after dark, raccoons sniffing around the barn, a coyote slinking along the fence line around midnight. Normal stuff. Nothing that would explain why the cattle were still bunching up or why the dogs kept barking at the tree line. I started thinking maybe I'd wasted money on the cameras, that whatever had been around had already moved on. Night 4 changed everything. I checked the cameras on the 5th morning like I'd been doing, pulling the memory cards and reviewing the footage on my laptop in the barn. The first 5 cameras showed the usual nighttime activity, more deer, a fox, nothing interesting. But the 6th camera, the one mounted on the western fence line, had captured something at 2:47 in the morning. The footage started with an empty field, just darkness and the faint glow of starlight. Then something massive moved into frame from the left side. At first I thought the camera had malfunctioned, that I was seeing some kind of distortion or shadow. But I rewound it and watched again, and there was no mistake. A creature walking upright on 2 legs, moving along my fence line in the middle of the night. It was huge. The fence posts are 5 feet tall, and this thing's shoulders were well above them, putting its height somewhere between 8 and 9 feet. Covered in dark fur, black or dark brown, hard to tell in the infrared footage. It moved deliberately, not hurried, each step careful and measured. Every few seconds it would stop and turn its head toward the forest, like it was watching for something or listening. But it never looked toward the house or the barn, never even glanced in that direction. I watched the clip 5 times, my hands shaking so bad I could barely work the mouse. My first thought was that someone was messing with me, that this had to be a person in a costume. But who would do that? My property is miles from the nearest town, end of a dirt road that doesn't go anywhere else. There's no reason for anyone to be out here, especially not at 3 in the morning. And the way it moved didn't look like a person in a suit. Too fluid, too natural. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Arms too long, shoulders too broad, head too large. I saved the footage to my computer and sat there in the barn trying to make sense of it. Part of me wanted to show my wife, but another part wasn't ready to admit what I was seeing. So I kept it to myself and went about my day, checking on the cattle, fixing a broken gate, doing the normal ranch work. But my mind kept drifting back to that footage, to that massive figure walking my fence line like it owned the place. That evening, I checked all the cameras again, even though it was only midday. Nothing new. But I knew I'd be watching that footage over and over tonight, trying to convince myself I was seeing things, trying to find some logical explanation that didn't involve accepting the impossible. Over the next week, I became obsessed with those cameras, checked them every morning, sometimes twice a day. And the creature showed up again and again, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always following the same route. Western fence line to northern property boundary, then back into the forest, like it was patrolling, like it had a routine. I captured it on 4 different cameras over those 7 days. Each clip showed the same thing, a massive, upright figure moving deliberately along the perimeter of my property. In one clip, it stopped next to a fence post and stood there for almost 30 seconds, completely still, just watching the forest. In another, it bent down and picked something off the ground, examined it briefly, then tossed it aside. The movements were intelligent, purposeful. This wasn't some mindless animal wandering through. This thing was thinking. But here's what really got me. The creature never approached the barn, the house, or the cattle directly. It stuck to the fence line, to the edges of my property. And after about a week of this, I noticed something strange. The cattle had stopped bunching up at night. They were spreading out again, grazing normally, acting like cattle should act. The horses weren't spooked anymore either. I could lead them anywhere on the property without resistance. The dogs still barked at the tree line some evenings, but it wasn't the frantic, terrified barking from before. Just their normal alert bark, letting me know something was out there. When I went out to check on them, they'd wag their tails and settle down pretty quick. The fear was gone. That's when it hit me. The animals weren't afraid anymore because whatever had been threatening them was gone, or at least being kept away. This creature, this thing walking my fence line every night, wasn't causing the problem. It was solving it. The cattle were calm because they felt safe. The horses relaxed because the threat, whatever it was, had been driven off. This massive figure I'd been watching on my trail cameras wasn't stalking my property. It was protecting it. The realization was both terrifying and bizarre. I had a Bigfoot, or whatever you want to call it, acting as some kind of guardian for my land, and I had no idea why. Night 12, mid-October. The camera on the north boundary captured something that made my blood run cold. It was around 3 in the morning, same time the creature usually showed up. The footage started normally, empty field, dark tree line in the background. Then the creature entered frame from the right, following its usual patrol route. But this time, it wasn't alone. Back in the tree line, maybe 50 yards behind the fence, I could see eyes, multiple sets of glowing eyes reflecting the camera's infrared light. At least 4, maybe 5 pairs, all at different heights, all watching. The creature on my side of the fence stopped walking and turned to face them. For a long moment, nothing moved, just this standoff between the creature and whatever was in those woods. Then the creature started making aggressive displays. It pounded its chest with both fists, the sound loud enough to register on the camera's audio. It grabbed a dead branch from the ground and shook it violently, then threw it toward the tree line. The display went on for maybe 20 seconds, chest beating, branch shaking, what looked like it was roaring, though the audio was too distorted to hear clearly, asserting dominance, telling those things in the forest to back off. And they did. One by one, the glowing eyes disappeared back into the darkness. The creature watched for another minute, then resumed its patrol like nothing had happened. It walked the rest of the fence line, disappeared into the forest on the south end of my property, and that was it. But I sat there staring at that footage for an hour, replaying it over and over. Whatever was out there beyond my fence line, it was what had been terrifying my animals. Those eyes in the forest, those were the threat. And this creature had positioned itself between them and my pasture, acting as a barrier, a protector. The cattle knew it, the horses knew it, probably even the dogs knew it. They'd been afraid of what was in the forest, not what was walking my fence. I spent the rest of that day trying to wrap my head around it. There was a whole dynamic happening on my land that I'd been completely unaware of. Territorial disputes between creatures I didn't even believe existed a month ago. And somehow, I'd ended up in the middle of it. The next few nights brought more evidence that something was seriously wrong in those woods. I started finding things around the property that hadn't been there before. Rock piles stacked in odd formations near the tree line, like cairns marking territory. Tree branches bent and woven together into crude structures, almost like shelters or warning signs. And the sounds at night got worse. Deep, guttural howls coming from the forest, not quite like wolves or coyotes, something more primal and unsettling. The protective creature's patrols became more frequent. Instead of once per night, I started seeing it on camera twice, sometimes even 3 times between dusk and dawn. It was spending more time on my property, checking the fence line more thoroughly, lingering in certain spots like it was standing guard. The tension was building toward something. I could feel it. Then one evening at dusk, I saw it with my own eyes. I was out by the barn finishing up evening chores when I caught movement near the tree line, maybe 200 yards away. I froze, thinking it might be elk, but when I looked closer, I saw the silhouette, massive, upright, unmistakable. It was standing at the edge of the woods, partially hidden by a large pine tree, just watching. We made eye contact. I'm certain of it. Even at that distance, even in the failing light, I felt the weight of its gaze. It wasn't aggressive, wasn't threatening, just acknowledging that I was there, that it knew I'd seen it. The moment lasted maybe 5 seconds, though it felt like much longer. Then it turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing between the trees like a shadow. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I'd just seen a Bigfoot, not on a camera, not in grainy footage, but with my own eyes. And it had looked right at me. I stood there for 10 minutes after it left, just staring at the spot where it had been, trying to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to run into the house and tell my wife, but I knew how insane it would sound. So I kept it to myself, finished my chores with shaking hands, and went inside for dinner like everything was normal. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about that moment of eye contact, the intelligence I'd seen in its gaze. This wasn't some dumb animal. This was something that thought, that planned, that understood far more than I was comfortable admitting. And it was guarding my property from threats I couldn't even see. Late October, around 3 a.m, I woke up to chaos. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The sounds were so loud and violent, they didn't seem real. Roaring, screaming, the crack of breaking wood, all coming from somewhere on my property. My wife woke up too, grabbing my arm and asking what was happening. I told her I didn't know, but I was going to check. I grabbed my rifle from the safe, loaded it, and headed outside in my pajamas and boots. The dogs were going absolutely insane, barking and howling like I'd never heard before. As soon as I stepped off the porch, I could hear it clearly. Something massive was fighting near the north pasture. The sounds were deafening. Thuds, crashes, guttural roars that made the hair on my arms stand up. I ran toward the noise, flashlight in one hand and rifle in the other. As I got closer to the fence line, I could see movement in the darkness. Large shapes grappling with each other, throwing each other around like they weighed nothing. The protective creature was fighting for its life against at least 4 others, maybe 5. They were bigger than it was, or at least seemed more aggressive. They had it surrounded, taking turns rushing in and attacking while the others circled. I watched from about 50 yards away, too stunned to move. One of the aggressive creatures picked up a fence post, a solid wooden post set in concrete, and swung it like a club. The protective creature blocked it with its arm and countered with a punch that sent the attacker sprawling. Another rushed in from the side, tackling it to the ground. They rolled in the dirt, both of them roaring. The fence was getting destroyed in the process, posts snapping, wire tearing loose. The protective creature managed to get back on its feet, but it was clearly hurt. Its movements were slower, more defensive. The other sensed weakness and closed in, forming a tighter circle. That's when I realized it was going to lose this fight. These things were going to kill it, and then there'd be nothing between them and my property. Between them and my cattle, my home, my wife sleeping in the house. I didn't think. I just raised the rifle and fired 3 shots into the air. The crack of gunfire split the night, echoing across the pasture. Everything stopped. All 5 of the aggressive creatures turned and looked at me, their eyes glowing in my flashlight beam. For a terrible moment, I thought they were going to charge, and I'd just signed my own death warrant. But they didn't. They looked at each other, then back at me, then scattered, just turned and ran back into the forest, crashing through the underbrush and disappearing in seconds. The protective creature stood there in the wreckage, breathing hard, favoring its left side. It looked at me across the distance, and for the second time we made eye contact. I saw something in its expression, surprise maybe, or gratitude. It was hard to say. Then it nodded. I swear to you, it nodded its head, just slightly, acknowledging what I'd done. And then it limped back toward the tree line, holding its injured side, moving slower than I'd ever seen it move before. It reached the edge of the forest and paused, looking back one more time. Then it was gone. I stood there for another 5 minutes, rifle still raised, waiting to see if anything else would come out of those woods. Nothing did. The night went silent except for the sound of my own breathing and the cattle stirring nervously in the pasture. When I finally lowered the gun, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold it. I went back to the house and told my wife there'd been coyotes after the cattle, that I'd scared them off with warning shots. She accepted that explanation, though I could tell she knew something wasn't right. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table until dawn, unable to sleep, replaying the fight over and over in my head. As soon as the sun came up, I went back out to the north pasture to survey the damage. The fence was demolished for about 30 yards. Posts snapped off at ground level, wire torn completely loose, sections of it lying in twisted heaps. The ground was torn up like a battlefield, deep gouges in the dirt where something heavy had been dragged or thrown. I found tufts of fur caught on the broken wire, some dark brown and some lighter, almost reddish. There was blood too, dark stains on the ground and splattered on the fence posts. The footprints were everywhere, huge five-toed prints pressed deep into the soft earth, overlapping and crisscrossing in chaotic patterns. I counted at least 6 distinct sets, all roughly the same size and shape. The fight had been real. The damage was real. This wasn't some hallucination or trick of the light. Whatever had happened here last night, it had left physical evidence that I'd be dealing with for days. I followed the protective creature's tracks back toward the tree line. They showed it had been favoring its left side, the prints on that side shallower and more uneven. Drops of blood marked the trail. I wanted to follow it into the forest to see if it was okay, but some survival instinct told me that was a bad idea. So I stopped at the tree line and just stared into the woods, hoping it had found somewhere safe to recover. The cattle were fine, huddled in the far corner of the pasture, but unharmed. The damage was limited to the fence and the immediate area where the fight had taken place. Whatever the protective creature had been doing, it had worked. Those aggressive creatures never got close to my livestock. The thing I'd been thinking of as a threat had been the only thing standing between my property and real danger. I spent the morning taking photos, collecting the fur samples, documenting everything before I started cleaning up. Part of me wanted to call someone, the sheriff, a wildlife biologist, anybody. But what would I even say? That I had Bigfoots fighting on my property? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, I thought I was crazy. So I kept my mouth shut and started the work of repairing the fence. The weeks after that fight were strange. The protective creature still showed up on my trail cameras, but less frequently and always keeping more distance. It looked like it had recovered from whatever injuries it sustained. I saw it walking normally again after about a week, its movements fluid and strong. But something had changed. It was more cautious now, more aware of my presence. I started leaving things for it. Nothing dramatic, just offerings at the edge of the tree line where it usually entered my property. Apples from the trees in our yard, bags of corn from the barn, salt licks that I normally use for the cattle. Every morning, whatever I'd left would be gone. I never saw it take the food on camera. It was smart enough to avoid the cameras when it wanted to, but I knew it was the one taking it. It felt like the least I could do after what it had done for us. The aggressive creatures never came back, or if they did, they stayed well beyond my property lines. The forest went quiet again, the way it used to be. No more howling at night, no more rock piles or branch structures appearing. Whatever territorial dispute had been happening, it seemed to be over. The protective creature had won, and my land was part of its territory now. That thought should have terrified me, but it didn't. If anything, it made me feel safer. My animals went back to normal too. The cattle spread out and grazed peacefully, the horses stopped spooking, the dogs settled into their old routines. It was like the whole September nightmare had never happened, except for the knowledge I now carried. I knew what was out there. I knew what walked these mountains at night. And I knew that some of them were willing to protect us, even at great personal cost. I started thinking about these creatures differently. Before all this, if I'd believed in Bigfoot at all, I would have imagined them as simple animals. Big, scary, dangerous. But what I'd witnessed proved they were so much more than that. They had social structures, territories they defended, concepts of honor or debt. Some protected, some destroyed, same as humans. They weren't just animals and they weren't just monsters. They were something in between, something we don't have a category for. I thought about the protective creature often, wonder where it is, and whether it's watching my property from the forest right now. I hope it knows I'm grateful. I hope it understands that I won't betray its presence here, that its secret is safe with me. Some things aren't meant to be shared with the world, and this is one of them. It's been 3 months since that night, and I still check the trail cameras every morning. The protective creature shows up occasionally, usually around dawn or dusk, still following its patrol route along my fence line. Sometimes it stops and looks toward the house, like it's checking to make sure everything's okay. Then it continues on its way, disappearing back into the forest until the next time. I've kept all the footage, hundreds of clips now, stored on an external hard drive in my desk drawer. I haven't shown it to anyone except my wife, and only after making her promise not to tell anyone else. She watched the clips in silence, her face going pale when she saw how big the creatures were. When it was over, she asked if we should move. I told her no. This land has been in my family for 3 generations, and we're not leaving because of something that's been here longer than we have. The truth is, I feel safer now than I did before all this started. I know what's out there, and I know that not all of it wants to hurt us. The protective creature proved that. It could have ignored my property, could have let those aggressive ones take what they wanted and moved on, but it didn't. It chose to defend this land, to stand between the threats in the forest and the animals under my care. That means something. I've thought about reaching out to researchers, people who study these creatures, but I always stop myself. The moment I do that, my property becomes a circus. Scientists, camera crews, curiosity seekers, all of them tramping through my land, trying to catch a glimpse of something that deserves to be left alone. The protective creature trusted me enough to let me see it, trusted that I wouldn't expose its presence to the world. I won't betray that trust. So I keep the footage private. I keep the story to myself. The only reason I'm sharing it now is to make a point. That what we think we know about these mountains, about what lives in the deep wilderness, is incomplete. There are things out there that science hasn't cataloged, creatures that exist in the spaces between what we understand and what we fear. Some of them are dangerous, but some of them, against all logic and expectation, are protectors. The monsters we imagine lurking in the forest aren't always the ones we should fear. Sometimes the real monsters are the ones we can't see, the ones that stay hidden in the shadows and only reveal themselves when they come for what's ours. And sometimes the creatures we think are monsters are actually the only things keeping those real threats at bay. I still ranch this land the way my grandfather and father did, but with an awareness now that I'm not alone here. I share this place with something ancient, something powerful, something that chose to protect me when it didn't have to. That creature gave me and my family a gift, the gift of safety, of peace of mind, of knowing that when darkness falls and the forest comes alive with sounds we can't identify, there's a guardian standing watch. Every evening when I finish my work and head back to the house, I glance toward the tree line. Sometimes I see nothing. Sometimes I see a shadow that's darker than the rest, a shape that doesn't quite belong. I never try to approach it. I just raise my hand in acknowledgement, in thanks, and the shadow seems to shift slightly before disappearing back into the forest. My grandfather used to tell me that this land would always take care of us if we took care of it. I never fully understood what he meant until now. The land doesn't just mean the soil and the grass and the water. It means everything that lives here, everything that calls this place home, including the things we can't see, the things we don't talk about, the things that walk the fence line at 3 a.m, making sure we're safe. I still don't know exactly what these creatures are. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever name you want to use, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that they're real, they're intelligent, and they're not all the same. They have individuals among them just like we do, some good, some bad, most probably somewhere in between. The one that guards my property chose to be good, chose to help. And that's something I'll never forget. So if you're reading this and thinking I'm crazy, that's fine. I thought I was crazy too for a while. But the cattle in my pasture tell a different story. The horses that don't spook anymore tell a different story. The fence I had to rebuild, the bloodstains I had to scrub off the posts, the tufts of fur I keep in a jar in my desk, all of it tells a different story. This happened. It's still happening. And somewhere in the forest behind my property, a massive creature with dark fur and intelligent eyes is watching over my land, keeping the things that would harm us at bay. That's the truth I live with now, and honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. The world is stranger and more wonderful than we give it credit for. The wilderness still holds secrets that we haven't uncovered, mysteries that maybe we're not meant to solve. And sometimes, just sometimes, those mysteries decide to protect us instead of harm us. All we have to do is recognize them for what they are and show a little gratitude in return. I leave apples at the tree line every week now. It's become part of my routine, something I do without thinking. And every week, the apples are gone by morning. That's all the confirmation I need that my guardian is still out there, still watching, still protecting. We have an understanding, this creature and I. I won't expose it, and it won't let anything harm what's mine. It's the strangest relationship I've ever had, and the one I value most. 3 generations of my family worked this land without ever knowing what was really out there. Now I know, and that knowledge has changed me. I look at the forest differently. I listen to the sounds at night with new understanding. I respect the boundaries between the human world and whatever exists beyond our fences. And I sleep better knowing that when those boundaries are threatened, there's something out there willing to defend them. Sometimes the monsters in the forest aren't the ones we should fear. Sometimes they're the ones keeping us safe from worse things. That's what I learned from a creature I never believed in. On a ranch, I thought I understood. The world is full of surprises, and not all of them are bad. Some of them, against all odds, turn out to be blessings in disguise. That's my story. That's what happened on my 400 acres in eastern Oregon, in the shadow of the Wallowa Mountains. Believe it or don't, I'm past caring about that. I know what I saw. I know what walks my fence line at night. And I know that I'm grateful for it, even if I'll never fully understand it. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some questions better left unasked. As long as the apples keep disappearing and the cattle stay safe, that's all I need to know. For more interesting stories, check this out.